Hey guys, welcome back to the Carrot Poker School. This is the Grade 2 exam, and here's your feedback. I hope you've had a chance to have an attempt at these exercises. Let's get into what I think about the answers. As we said, this exam is going to ask you why things are the case, so there are no prizes here for copying solver outputs or for looking up answers in solvers. The idea is that we figure out why the strategies that are being recommended are being recommended. Please do make sure you've had an attempt at this before we get going, and without any further ado, let's get started on question 1. Question 1 asks us to compare the button's choice of sizing after c-betting on ace-9-6 two-tone. On the 3 following turn cards, we have the ace of clubs, the 5 of hearts, and the 4 of diamonds. I've said here it might be useful to reference EV or equity as we see each card, because those things are going to help us understand the choice of bet frequency and to some extent sizing, although the latter is governed a lot by nut advantage and relative polarization, as we know. So let's take a look at the sim for this, and I will explore these 3 turn cards individually. The first turn card is the ace of clubs, pairing the top card on the board, and when big blind checks here, we see the following recommendation. This is quite unusual for the in-position player, for the solver to be recommending so much small betting, and as we covered in the course, it's completely viable to remove this small betting and decide not to bet a 9. I don't think there'll be a big EV loss here, as we can see from checking these 9x combos, even the ones that are pure bets. We can see at the bottom right of the screen that there's not a lot of EV loss by choosing to check them instead. The reason the solver is liking B33 here as a strategic choice is basically that 9x is both a relatively high EV pair that can be value bet again on a card like an ace. Because the ace makes it harder for our opponent to actually hold trips now, what would have been top pair on the flop, the 9 has now been promoted. Because the big blind player would have also 3-bet 10s through kings at pure frequency, we don't have to worry about those either. So the 9 is actually quite a high equity hand to hold on a card like this. You can see here that the equity of 9x is coming in at around 64 or 61%. What makes this a bet is that it's a vulnerable hand as well. So if we compare this to something like kings or queens that really aren't too fussed about betting, kings in fact is just playing as a check back here if you didn't check back flop already with it. If you range bet flop, you'll have all of the combos of kings, of course. If you split on the flop, then you shouldn't have that many. But these combos aren't betting because they don't share the same usefulness of fold equity that 9x is going to garner by making the opponent fold. Fold over cards, fold back doors, things like that. Of course, they're not going to fold like Jack 10 of hearts, but there's useful fold equity nonetheless. So the ace of clubs, the main reason that sizing is going to decrease on a card like this is that we have some interest in value betting thin but vulnerable hands like 9x. The reason we wouldn't overbet is that the nut advantage, the ace-x combos are completely shared, and if we were to start overbetting, we would cause this very big shift in villain's range where basically ace-x becomes the main continuing hand. The only hand you make indifferent with the overbet here are certain combos of non-heart 9x. You make none of this ace-x indifferent, so you're just basically overpaying for that indifference. We've talked about this during the Carrot Poker School Grade 2. Effectively, you don't need to bet that much to make hands like pocket pairs and king highs and gut shots and open end straight draws indifferent. They're going to become indifferent at a much smaller sizing threshold. So another way of seeing this is just that the ace is polarizing-ish to villain's range, but it's a card that actually helps our range. We have a very high bet frequency here, 64% in general, and an EV that's pretty high here of 53%, even though our equity is only 45. And the reason for this is just that our kings, queens, jacks sort of combos are actually doing quite well on an ace. They're quite pleased to see the ace because they're already losing to ace-x on the flop, but that hand now became more scarce in villain's range. Let's look at the 5 of hearts turn now. So what we see here is the EV is lower. This is normal because this is a card that has a lot to do with the flop texture. We noted in grade 2 that when we have a card that tends to smash the flop, tends to relate strongly to cards that had incentive to continue on the flop because it's similar in nature, that's going to favor the out of position player, i.e. the big blind in this case, a lot more. The reason for this is that while we would bet a lot of our trash on the flop, if we skip back to our flop betting range here, we see that we're betting hands that are pretty terrible, like the Jack 8 of clubs. And we're allowed to do that because we're in position in a favourable world, harvesting a lot of fold equity, more than the pot odds norm by 10%, so very good. And villain, on the other hand, is going to be not calling hands like Jack 8 of clubs. So they're going to get to the turn the big blind that is, with a much more condensed and airless range compared to us, and they're going to really connect with the 5 because the pre-flop holdings that are incentivized to continue the most on the flop, but not 3-bet so much pre-flop, are things that hit this 5, either hearts or 7-8. So that's not all of Villain's range, but it's enough to deter us from overbetting. We can see here that the solver doesn't like the idea of overbetting on such a card, just favoring now the big bet. The reason that we don't use the small bet anymore is that when you think about the hands that are driving our betting range for value, we're no longer as interested in betting 9x combos, unless of course we have the 9x of hearts, which is a big enough hand being a flush. But when we have other 9x, we're not going to be interested in opening for a small sizing. It's now too thin. So we kind of ask our range, well, what do you want to reopen with, range? And the range says, I want to reopen with ace, queen, ace, jack plus. And if that's the case, we may as well just use a big bet. So I can totally be lenient to someone that wanted to use a small bet in the previous example, even though it goes against the simplification suggested in the school. But on this card, I really see no reason whatsoever for building a small bet here. We should also note that we've told our solver to never lead the turn here. The reason I've done that is that most people don't lead on this turn. It would have a small lead frequency if we allowed it to do so. So overall, to summarize what this 5 of hearts does, it's a lower EV card for a range because it's so to do with the flop in nature. That said, it is a card that we have less need for small bets on, so our sizing will be a bit bigger routinely, but it's still not a card we can overbet because Villain has caught up in terms of nut advantage. The kind of card we can overbet is very much going to be this final turn card here, the 4 of diamonds, so let's take a look at that. Now we see the sea of purple, the biggest sizing color in our color code chart, and there's no surprise because on blank turns, these are really the ones you want to go ahead and consider overbetting on because the gulf in range polarization is going to be bigger, meaning that your nut advantage is massive. And now when you ask the hands in your range, what do you want to value bet? And again, here the 9x hasn't been promoted by the presence of the second ace, so it's not really good enough to value bet, even for the small sizing, although with the heart draw, it starts to creep into the strategy. I would ignore that. I would play overbet or check on this node. The idea being that your unique value hands like ace queen plus that Villain doesn't really have due to the fact that they would have 3-bet them pre-flop, these are going to be really crushing now. So when we look at the equity of a hand like ace queen ace king, it's going to be 83, 84%, something like that. When we look at EV, it's probably going to be more than the pot. Yeah, 109, 111, things of this nature. Another reason why you might want to overbet here is that your formerly totally nutted hands like 2-pair and sets just remain nutted, and if you look at the EV difference here, there isn't a huge one between big bet and overbet, so if you really want to cut the overbet out, you can, but then what you'll be doing is placing more pressure on yourself to actually overbet the river on a node like this, very large, like for B400 or something like that. All in all, we can see on a brick turn that our EV is very high, even though our equity is still not so good. It's very similar to what it was on an ace. Our EV is higher, and the reason for that is that we've preserved our nut advantage, and nutty hands, because they're entitled to so much of the pot, they tend to get a very good deal on their equity. They tend to convert their equity into EV in a very favorable way, and that's why we want to overbet here. We have a big polarization advantage. Hopefully that makes sense and you can see the distinct differences between all of these cards and why the solver is choosing different strategies on each one. Let's move on to question 2. Question 2 of the exam concerns this out of position turn probe opportunity for big blind. In this situation, we need to decipher roughly what we think big blind's turn probe frequency will be with range and why. Secondly, what is the sizing going to be? Which is the better bluff, 7-5 of clubs or ace queen of hearts, and why? And then finally, why is betting this hand ace of diamonds, jack of hearts worse than folding? Meaning actually worse than 0 EV. Okay, let's get into it. Firstly, and as we can see here, the turn probe frequency is extremely low. This is no surprise given that the EV for out of position here is only 40% of the pot. If you're thinking, well, the under the gun player checked back, so why is out of position's EV so low? The idea is that when under the gun checks back, they're supposed to be checking a range that does preserve their range advantage while they're not going to check back here with a set or even a hand like ace king terribly often. They're going to have some of those hands, and they're also just going to protect this range with tons of top pair, under pair, things of this nature. So under the gun is going to move towards the middle here, not move towards being weak, just capped. Because under the gun is capped, it means that big blind will like to lead with a big sizing, taking advantage of nut advantage, and realistically the only hands that big blind wants to lead here are going to be combos like sets, 2-pair, really good king x, etc. You can see here that the value betting really runs out very quickly, and there's only a few combos of naked king x betting, and these tend to be ones with the flush draw. When we have a combo like the king 10 of clubs, we're just checking here because we have an extreme need to protect our checking range in this spot. When we check, villain will be betting a ton if they didn't bet on the flop, so betting about 60% of the time there, so we don't have to worry about leading value hands when we can also check raise, just going by that old adage that we introduced in the school. Sizing is big because the type of hands that actually want to do some leading here are just monsters for value, and we're going to balance them with semi-bluffs. You can see our heart draws are leading here, but that's not all. We're also going to be betting some combos like ace 3, and it's definitely okay to start over betting. You do need to be selective about what you're bluffing though. So infrequent betting strategy based on a big EV disadvantage and just being in an unfavorable world, being very selective with bluffs, being very strict with how good a hand needs to be to lead for value, and still slow playing many of those, and then using the big sizing due to the nut advantage that we have after a button checks back flop, and we build that very acutely concentrated range around the top of our range and our bluffs. So this is very normal for turn probe opportunities on unfavorable textures. C asks us which is a better bluff, 7-5 of clubs or ace of hearts, queen of hearts, and why? There's a few things going on here. Firstly, 7-5 of hearts is a high enough EV hand that it doesn't mind actually bluffing, even though we're in such an unfavorable world. You can see that the other 7-5 here, just having absolutely nothing but a naked gut shot, is going to be entitled to 8% of the pot, and that's actually barely going to be enough to start bet. We can do it, it's okay. It's not a big deal, but the 7-5 of hearts we can afford to throw in there a lot more often. But 7-5 of clubs is definitely still a completely fine bluff, and it's one that's acceptable. You just want to be a bit careful that you don't lose control of your bet frequency with a naked gutter and end up just having an over bluffing sort of strategy because you have so few value hands that you can actually lead at the sizing and that you want to lead it in general. So we need to be a bit careful there, but 7-5 is definitely an okay bluff. The reason that we can understand that is that the EV difference between betting and checking with 7-5 is basically nothing as long as we go for the very big sizing here. You can see that when villain's range is quite condensed, a bigger sizing just tends to leverage more EV, both with the nuts and with hands that can become the nuts like 7-5. The idea with that draw is that when you hit a straight, you're going to have the immortal nuts most of the time. Of course, the 6 of hearts is a little bit different, but even then, your hand is going to be really strong. Ace Queen of Hearts, on the other hand, is a bit of an absurd bluff to make. The idea here is that you blunder a ton of EV by betting this hand. This hand is a much better hand in overall terms, so if you were to do the better bluffs fallacy here and actually commit that flawed thought process, you would reason that Ace Queen of Hearts is entitled to 48% of the pot, but 7-5 only 38%, therefore it must be a better bluff. Wrong. It's not a better bluff, it's a better hand. The measure of how good a hand is to bluff is, of course, the difference between the EV of betting and the EV of checking. And as we can see here, that's actually quite extreme. This is in percent pot, so losing something like 6% of what's already a normal pot of about 6 big blinds or 5 big blinds, depending on the pre-flop open. That's still going to be meaningful long term. Ace Queen is actually closer to some sort of value bet, I would think, or just bizarre merge if you were to bet with it. When your hand gets weaker, you can start bluffing because you're entitled to way less of the pot against under the gun as you would be against button or something. So with ace 10 of hearts here, you can turn that into a bluff without EV loss. You just can't do that with ace queen because it's too far up. It's similar to a hand like pocket nines, you would never bet with that. It's the same thing, the hand is just too mediocre in terms of equity. Don't let the heart draw fool you into thinking that your hand is a bet. So 7-5 of clubs is a much, much better bluff than ace queen, because even though ace queen is a better hand and has more equity and more nutted redraw, 7-5 has a more positive bluffing EV. That's the difference between bluffing and not bluffing, as we're going to meet that term fully in grade 3. Part D asks us why betting with ace of diamonds, jack of hearts is actually going to be a worse proposition than folding. And indeed, when we look at this hand, we can actually see that it runs negative when we consider betting and slightly positive to check. This hand doesn't have a lot of showdown value. It's actually obtaining most of its check EV from the rare opportunity of binking a jack or an ace and then being good, or perhaps eking out a little bit of value on the river. So we're not checking this hand because we think it's swimming in showdown value, but the problem with this hand in particular is that it blocks the hell out of villain's folding range. If we look at what villain actually folds to an overbet here, it's going to be, by and large, a lot of ace-x and jack-x. These cards are going to appear time and time again in villain's folding range because they just constitute a lot of the airball hands remaining on this texture. The jack of hearts is better than the other jacks here for bluffing, but it's still a ridiculous bluff to make, given that the hand shows down for a little bit of EV, and given that the hand is just got very negative blockers and not nutted enough equity to start leading in such an unfavorable world for range. Finally, note that if we had the ace of hearts instead of the jack of hearts, we're now removing enough of villain's continues because they have way more ace-x suited than jack-x suited. from their range, and therefore our fold equity is a bit better. We can also hit a pair of aces on the river without it also bringing the flush, which is a nice bonus if we have the ace of hearts. So which heart we have matters, but yeah, overbetting with this hand is actually worse than folding. Be better off mucking your hand than overbetting with this combo. That's what happens in unfavorable worlds. You'll recall that the pot odds norm fold equity for B150 is 60%, and here Villain is folding 10% less than that, being in position with a very strong range. We have to be incredibly careful when it comes to what we lead in turn spots like this. Hopefully that's a good lesson on turn probing. Let's move on to question 3. Question 3 concerns this double delayed c-bet opportunity. Part A says, why are ace highs mandatory bets in this spot? Explain the fold equity for B75 compared with that pot odds norm value. Why is it actually higher? You would have found that it's higher. How do you rate the play of checking 7-6 of clubs on the river? And finally, why is Jack 10 able to bet here? And can you explain why the EV of bet is higher than check with this particular hand? To answer part A, when we start off by looking at ace-x here, we notice that they actually have to bet. They're pure betting whenever they don't have a pair, only starting to check down when they reach tier 4 like ace-9 or ace-5. When we compare the EV difference here of betting and checking with a hand such as ace-7, we can see that it's a dramatic EV loss here to check such a holding. What's going on? The idea is that the cutoff player here is just experiencing an incredibly favourable world in which their range is crushing the big blind opponent. They've not bet yet, fair enough, but they still have way more combos of just random broadways containing a queen, 2 pair, things like that. They can hit top set on the river if they've not bet flopped. With kings they probably have. But the point stands that they just have way more combos of 2 pair plus on this kind of run out and far less combos of bad hands as well. The cutoff would have bluffed a lot of their air up until this point, so the remaining ace-high combos they actually reach this node with, note they're not that many because they're actually meant to bet flop or turn with back doors or front doors and just being in a very favourable world and position. But when they do get to the river, they're just realising far more fold equity than the break-even point. Again, if we'd be 75 here, we'd expect 42%. We're getting 57%, so the reason that ace-highs are mandatory bets to answer A is that they are fairly low showdown value hands in a very favourable world in which the fold equity is far above and beyond the pot odds norm. And to answer part B, why is that the case? It's because we're in such a favourable world. We've actually kept the range advantage and the texture has rolled off in this sort of way where it really begins to punish the low cards that big blind holds a monopoly over pre-flop and reward the big cards with which we hold a monopoly pre-flop. We retain a lot of status quo here by checking down. We don't forfeit the range advantage. That's the main point. How do we rate the play of checking back 7-6 of clubs? Absolutely abysmal, abhorrent. This play is one of the biggest, most striking references to river blunder theorem we could ever have. Again, to reiterate that concept from lecture 2, river blunder theorem is the idea that if we're in a favourable spot for range with a hand that has no pot share, then it's clearly better to bet than it is to check because the fold equity is above the pot odds norm, but the checking EV is 0. As we can see here, it's kind of interesting. We do actually get to chop sometimes by checking back the 7-6 here. It's really bizarre, right? You wouldn't think so. But because Villain is in such an awful world for range, they actually have to avoid bluffing here with certain combos like this. So we have a tiny amount of pot share, 8% pot by checking. But because the fold equity is so high here in general, we do much better. We have double that in EV here by actually betting. So very important to understand that you commit an extremely big mistake here when you don't pull the trigger with such a hand. Part D asks us, why is Jack 10 of clubs able to bet here? Well, the idea is that by the time we've gone all the way to the river by checking down, Villain doesn't actually hold a great deal of Queen X on this node. If we look at what they arrive on the river with, there's some Queen X, but they're going to, of course, be betting that at pretty high frequency. That means when Villain checks here, they're mostly going to be bluff catching 1 pair, so it's really due to the action sequence. When you reach the river in this way, it becomes a small mistake to check back. You'll note that it's not a colossal error to check back here, but this hand is thick enough to value bet. As is a hand like Ace King, Pocket Aces, it's only when you get down. And in fact, these are actually a bit better because they unblock the calling range. Jack 10 does block calling range a lot as well, but still a value bet. When you get down to some form of weaker king like King 6, you can see that checking begins to come back into the fray again. Action sequence is really telling. Just because Jack 10 doesn't look like a big hand, you have to understand that when you go all the way to the river with no betting in a spot where a queen will invest at some point in both players' ranges most of the time, the queen is too insignificant a part of either range to stop a hand like 2 pair having the tier 2 equity to bet. Jack 10 is tier 2, it's B75ing. When we look at the equity here for the in position player, we can see this hand is classically in the tier 2 belt, coming in at 85%. You may not think it's that high, but it is. Think about how you got there. All right, let's move on to question 4. Question 4 is a button versus big blind spot, and it asks us to compare the sizes chosen by a solver in the following triple barrel situation. Of course, we can jam here for more than the pot, and that would be a normal thing to do in quite a polarized node for our range with some hands, but we can also go for a B75 or something smaller as well. Let's take a look at the sim. There's quite a distinct pattern here, but there are going to be some anomaly hands as well. That's to say hands that don't really fit the mold of what hands that are similar to them in nature are doing. Let's start with Pocket Kings. Pocket Kings is going for the full whack. It's shoving for 400% pot, which is the deepest shade of purple that we have here. The reason this hand is using this sizing is that its unblockers are extremely favorable. Well, first off, the hand has enormous equity. If you click on the equity view here, you'll see that it's squarely going to be a tier 1 hand coming in at 100%. You can even refer to that as tier 0 if you want to think about the hands that will 4x pot specifically. We wouldn't have to 4x pot, of course, if we'd overbet turn, but we can overbet the turn on the king, queen, queen. It's not the sort of texture that really allows for that. With the Pocket Kings, we're unblocking a queen. We can see that when we jam, the main source of calls from villain's range is queen x, though this is such a big shove that even queen x has to fold the majority of the time. Against a more stationary opponent, you can see how useful it would actually be to go for this shove, because it's quite possible you'd get called more than this. Meanwhile, King X is never supposed to call you for the most part, and villain is meant to be blocking your little boats here, or just have a little boat themselves in order to be pure calling, or have the nuts like King Queen, of course. So Pocket Kings jams got enough equity to do it. It's basically tier 1, and its unblockers are good. Pocket Queens is an equally good hand. Villain doesn't have queens or kings here, so this is another 100% equity tier 1 hand. The problem with overbetting 400% now, or even overbetting B150 now, we can see this hand is choosing B75, and for good reason. The problem is that villain just isn't really calling you if you go that big when your blockers are this negative. These blockers are terrible for you because they're just making it very difficult to be called by eliminating all of these combos that are calling at super high frequencies relative to the rest of villain's range. Therefore, we have to size down. We have to now start relying on being bluff raised a little bit more, or maybe even value raised by some worse hands. You can see here that when villain has hands like pocket 4s, they can value raise, and they're throwing in some weird bluffs here with counterfeited 2-pair, like king 4, king 3 with blockers to our boats. We're basically trying to get our value from a different part of villain's range, not because we're arbitrarily using the targeting pitfall and being like, I target this, but because we're actually saying, well, these hands are just really abundant now based on our removal effects, and so of course we have to mainly play against those hands. We're shifting our focus more from trying to get EV by value betting against Queen X, because that's now impossible when we have quad queens, to trying to get called by a king or get bluff raised, and to do that we have to go smaller. Queen Jack is of course a lower equity hand than the two that we've just looked at, however it's going to be using a bigger sizing than the Pocket Queens. When we look at the equity of Queen Jack, it is very much tier 1. It's not tier 0, so it's not going to go for the absolutely massive overbet, but it is going to be 150 and use the medium shade of purple there because it's a super high equity hand with only one queen blocker. When you're using B150 instead of B400, you actually get called by a good amount of King X as well. Although the hand class usually folds, it does pay you off a lot more than most other regions of villain's range. Only having one queen blocker is substantially better for the overbet than having two, and so as we can see, we're getting called by a lot more combos now. When we have the Queen of Hearts, none of the heart combos exist here, but all of the club ones still do, and that's the important thing, as well as some offsuit combos of Queen X that can pay off B150. With Queen 8, our kicker is lower, and now our hand is betting smaller because it's no longer high equity enough to be classed as tier 1. The equity of this hand comes in at 89%, a little bit below the threshold here. What that threshold is exactly for being able to overbet will vary texture by texture, because you need to rely on being called by quite a lot of trips. When you overbet here, blocking trips and losing to some other trips doesn't really cut it. If this board was a bit different, we may not need this much equity, but on trips boards you usually have to be a little bit more selective and have slightly higher standards for what hands get into which bet size for value. So Queen 8, classic tier 2, top of tier 2, but tier 2 nonetheless with a blocker to worse Queen X and using B75. Pocket Fours is another tier 1 hand. It's not quite the nuts, but it's pretty much up there because the only hand it loses to is King Queen. Therefore, this hand is going to be using a very big sizing. It's strong enough to be 400, and fortunately it does have blockers that are favourable in nature. It unblocks the calling range for the most part. Sadly, it blocks the raises, so it doesn't really like going smaller. One reason you wouldn't want to slow play 4s here is that villains actually mainly meant to bluff raise you when they have a 4 in their hand. Therefore, this is a hand that just wants to go for all the marbles itself. And finally, the King 10 of Diamonds. This hand is squarely in tier 4. While it's unusual for top pair to be in tier 4, when you've already bet twice and there are still trips in your opponent's range en masse, you don't want to consider this hand a value bet. When you look at its equity, although the hand usually wins at showdown, 67% is the sort of equity that's dicey to open the action with when you're in position. You want to keep that action firmly closed and just check back. If you open the action, the idea is you'll incur some raises sometimes. Whether they're bluff raises or value raises, they'll reduce the EV of this hand to 0, and when that happens, you'll just wish that you hadn't bet. While you can get called by worse sometimes, too many of the hands that continue against you are better hands, and while we should be avoiding this only get called by worse exaggeration fallacy, we do get called by a range that's doing fairly well against us if we were to bet this hand for any sizing. This hand is maybe strong enough out of position to be 33, in fact it definitely is, but in position again I'll stress it's just not worth reopening the action. Question 5 is all about delayed c-betting, blind versus blind. We check 833, an action we're going to do really frequently, and the big blind player checks back. Question A is, why does ace 10 of clubs mix in some b33 here? Does this not look like a mediocre hand? Why are we checking 6s and 8s sometimes? Don't we lose value by doing this? Why don't we check 3s if we're checking 8s and 6s? And why do hands like Jack 4 of Diamonds never bluff, but slightly better looking hands do? Let's get into the answers. To answer the question of why ace 10 of clubs value bets, that's part A. Let's start by looking at its equity. It's 60-ish%, so we can first off start by saying that this is definitely in no way, shape or form a bluff. In fact, if we look at villain's defense strategy against this, we'll see that no better hand ever folds. This is really normal based on the innocuous board and the fact that flop actually just went check check. So if you said bluff for this, you've got a lot of rethinking to do. There is not one single better hand folding, and therefore no element of bluff running in the betting sink. What elements are driving this bet? Mainly value. If you bet here and get called, you'll be around 50% due to the absolutely minimal and tiny amount of filtering that a b33 from out of position is likely to cause in your opponent's strategy. When you bet here, they're only folding 22%, using position to slightly over-defend relative to the pot odds norm. What that means is that the range they continue with is just going to have to be pretty weak, and your ace 10 is going to do well against that range. The other reason that you can bet this hand is for the denial of equity. When your opponent is here with some random hand with 2 live cards like Jack 9, they're usually going to be folding, although they're meant to find raises based on having spade blockers. I don't think that happens so much in reality, so I think b33 here is actually even safer against humans than it is against the solver. Why are we checking 6s and 8s sometimes, and don't we lose value this way? Well, the idea is that when you can check raise, you don't have to bet. These are also hands that unblock your opponent's bluffing range, and while they will sometimes incur an EV loss by your opponent checking back with ace 9 or something when they would have called a bet, the upside to this is that these hands are going to get much bigger pots in play when they're able to check raise, and they're going to maximize against the bottom of villain's range. It would just always fold to a bet. Imagine villain having something like the Jack 7 of clubs here. The only way to make money from a hand like that is to get it to bluff, and it's meant to bluff really frequently, unblocking some of the king high and queen high that are your most common folds. When you think about GTO in this spot, it's a bit tricky, but when you think back to lecture 5, it should make sense why these hands are just optional bets. Urgency is low, you're out of position with a bunch of nodes still to come, 1.5 nodes left after you check to be precise, so it's okay to go for that check raise. Why don't we check 3s? The idea with this hand is that you are unblocking hands in your opponent's range that will just frequently call a really big bet. So when you overbet here, you'll see that all of the 6x and all of the 8x is always calling. When you had one blocker to that range, it made overbet a bit of a less enticing proposition, but now that you unblock all of them, you may as well just go ahead and bet. If you check here, some 8x, although not much, and plenty of 6x is going to be checking back again, and so you are actually going to lose a little bit of value with this hand by checking. Why do hands like Jack 4 never bluff, but hands like Jack 9 do? This comes down to favourability. Out of position is in an okay world here. It's fairly favourable, but quite close to neutral. What that means is there'll need to be some standards about what this player bets. We can see that we didn't actually open Jack 4 on this sim, but Jack 5 will do as a nice comparison, and this hand is pure checking. I don't think it would be horrific to start bluffing small with this hand, and as we can see, there's only a medium EV loss from betting small here, but this hand is just a bit too pathetic to bet. The main thing that Jack 9 has going on that Jack 5 doesn't is extra pair draws and extra implied odds. Therefore, if we're actually going to go ahead and, let's say, overbet here with a hand like this, villain calls and we've got these extra pair draws, then let's say we bink the 9 on the river, for example. This will be a very strong hand that the solver is then happy to bet again for value, as you can see. So having 2 overcards that give you more implied odds and give you very powerful pair draws is much better than only having 1. The final answer to this question, to part D, is that the Jack 9 is more likely going to block some raises than the 4. When we look at what villain is going to raise here against the small bet, there will not be much 4x in there at all, but the 9 will be some of the bluff raising combos. Let's move on to question 6. Question 6 has quite a lot to do with urgency. This is a double barrel possibility, button versus big blind. And question A asks us how high urgency is here, and to list some examples that it would have on the betting frequencies of certain hands. So basically compare how urgent it is in position for some hands to go for value, where our hands basically pure betting. You can compare that with out of position as well. What did tier 3 hands do in this model and why? That will again be hands between about 60 and 70 something percent equity. C, bluffs like 5-4 of hearts are hopeless hands, but why are we betting them? Don't we have better bluffs? And finally D, in my sim, 5-4 of hearts has positive checking EV, 20% of the pot to be precise. How does it have that much? Why is such a bad hand entitled to a fifth of this pot? Surely it should be close to 0. Hopefully you've got some answers jotted down. Let's go through the sim. The answer part A, urgency here, is really high. We're in position, which is going to mean that we just can't slow play as much as we could in some other nodes. So you'll note here for out of position that when they have a hand like King Jack here, they're allowed to check because their urgency is lower, being at an earlier node in the hand and being able to check raise and inflate the pot that way, making up for lost ground. However, with our range, checking back King Jack or something like this is just really not viable. There is an EV loss associated with such a check, and if we have a hand like pocket 7s, although it's really rare that we check that on flop, the EV loss is even greater when we unblock villain's continuing range. So there are some hands here that look like pure bets that we can slow play, things like Queen 10 that block the calling range of the opponent, but for the most part the nuts have to bet. That said, I don't think urgency is quite as high as you may think in this sort of situation, and that's largely just going to be because many of the hands that aren't straights, and villain can have a straight, are going to block the calling range. So a lot of these 2-pair combos that you'll see slow playing sometimes here, that's mainly due to the effects they have on blocking that continuing range. We should also note that villain has no shortage of nuts here either, and is going to be slow playing this turn sometimes, so hands like 2-pair or top pair just aren't quite as good as they seem. However, when we have a combo like Ace King, although we should hardly ever have that, it's actually a pure bet when we do have it because the King is a blocker to King Jack, and that makes the value bet a bit thicker. But urgency is high. In position, delayed c-bet node, it's generally high, but maybe some hands just aren't quite as good as they look. That would be my answer to part A. Part B, what did tier 3 hands do? Well, they actually check. When you look at the sort of hand that has tier 3 equity, it's going to be something like Queen Jack, coming in at 69%. Why does that hand check? Because the only sizing it can use is a small bet, and when villain is still uncapped and being that tricky, trappy, out of position snake in the grass, sometimes it's just not worth it to reopen the action and incur check raising when you really don't need a lot more money to go in to reach the investment ceiling for such a hand. The investment ceiling for something like Queen Jack with 70% equity is only one more small to medium sized bet, so the idea is that we can always just check back and make that bet on the river. When the river bricks off here, as we can see, it's now time to start putting some money in the pot with this hand, but we don't need to do so immediately on this node on the turn. Don't reopen the action for small bets unless you need to. Out of position it's fine, because checking isn't so great anyway with the action already open, but in position that's something you need to refrain from. C asks us why 5-4 of hearts is a hopeless hand, but why we're betting a hand as hopeless as 5-4 of hearts. The idea is that the world is dramatically favourable for our range. Again, this just comes down to the river blunder theorem, but it's a street earlier this time. So it's not that we have to bet the 5-4 of hearts if we look at the EV difference between betting and checking. It's basically nothing. The solver does choose to pure bet it. It thinks it's microscopically better to bet than to check, and therefore it just lands at betting all the time. That said, this sim is run to a very high accuracy, and if you had a less accurate sim, it would probably be mixing at this kind of EV difference. You do need to keep the pressure up here. You need to be betting a lot long term in order to assume that you're playing a solid strategy, because you have no shortage of value hands here and not that many air hands with which you can bluff. Therefore, when you do have an air hand like 5-4, you're just doing a lot of betting in general. There's some weird blocker phenomena going on here that control the exact frequency of how often you want to bet with these sort of low hopeless cards and gutters alike, but the idea is that as a collective family, you just want to bet really frequently with all of these types of hand. Don't we have better bluffs? No, we don't. We don't really have a hand that's better to bluff than 5-4. We do have hands that are better than 5-4, but they're not necessarily better to bluff. For example, when we have a gutter, although the hand is quote unquote a better hand, it's not necessarily a better bluff, although there will be some hands that the solver thinks are bigger that gain more EV when they bluff, like Jack 5 of diamonds, but this is just noise. We don't need to worry about this when these EV differences are small. The main point is that we bluff hands when they don't suffer an EV loss from bluffing, when there are elements of bluffing present and the hand does not lose EV by bluffing, then it's okay to bluff, and there aren't really hands that are better to bluff than 5-4, just hands that are better than 5-4. That's the key difference. Why is the checking EV of a hand like 5-4 of hearts positive? It's all about this delayed future fold equity. If you were to check here, you would still be doing okay. You'd have 18% pot, which is a lot more than your equity. If you look at the equity of this hand, it's only coming in at about 6 or 7%, but basically gets twice the EV that it has equity. And when there's a big difference like that, it effectively has to be caused by an influx of fold equity. You can see on the river here, after we check back turn, if we did have a hand like 5-4, it's now about 25% of the pot difference between betting and checking. This is absolutely huge. As an interesting bonus side point, the 5-4 of spades is one of the best bluffs imaginable on the river, meaning it gains more EV by bluffing than by not bluffing than other hands do, because it actually unblocks the folding range. Villain is going to be probing turn a lot with a flush draw, but won't be with random 5 high and hands like that don't have that draw. Therefore, when we bet the river with 5-4 of spades, we unblock the most air combos in their range and get more fold equity. Overall, it's important to understand on the turn here that the EV of 5-4 comes from how well your range is actually doing and the extra fold equity garnered by that advantage. You can also, moreover, bink a 5 or a 4 on the river. That allows you to check down, although you're actually still close to bluffing even when that happens, but that's another part of that EV. Let's move on. Question 7, just like the lecture of the same number, is about facing bets. We face a turned barrel in this particular hand, and it's all about identifying thresholds within our range and using range geography to figure out how to react. The thresholds we care about here are firstly the robustness threshold. That's the point where a hand that derives its EV mainly from showdown value and usually won't need to improve or bluff to win is going to be calling or breaking even by calling as opposed to folding. B asks you to identify the frailness threshold. This is the point where an unmade hand that would derive its EV from improving or bluffing would want to start calling, and at which point that would become break even. C is about a grade A bluff catcher. That's a hand that's going to beat all bluffs but lose 12 value bets but have positive blocker properties. Grade B is similar but with neutral blocker properties, and grade C is going to have more negative properties, unblocking more bluffs and blocking less value. First off, the robustness threshold, that's to say the point in our range where calling and folding have the same EV, which is going to be 0 because the EV of folding is always 0, remember, is going to be spread around a few different made hands in our range. When it comes to pocket pairs with a spade, it's going to be something like pocket 4s or pocket 3s, which are roughly break even here. Don't worry too much about what the solver is doing, but look at its EV. If the EV is within 0.01 or 0.02 of a percent, you can probably say that that hand is on the threshold, even if it always calls or always folds. Moving up slightly to hands that have a pair on the board, but obviously no redraw because we don't have the offsuit variants of hands like 7-8 or 8-6. We have these sorts of hands, so 7-8 of hearts is a call, but 8-6 of hearts is a fold, somewhere around there. Does the EV difference between these two hands matter massively? No, they're effectively the same hand. There's not a great deal of difference. Moving on to our bluff catchers now. A grade A bluff catcher, this will be a hand that doesn't beat any value bets, but does beat all bluffs and is a very profitable call. So when we look at what villain is actually value betting here, we can see that it goes down to hands. Let's look at the B75. Sizing for now, I think that's the best one to concern ourselves with. It goes down to a hand like a mediocre king, like something like King 9 or something of that ilk. Therefore, when we have a hand like King 5, we can say that that hand is a bluff catcher. It's only entitled to 10% of the pot, but because we block so many value bets with the king here, this is actually just going to be a really juicy bluff catcher that's going to be way better than break even. We should also stress that another factor that determines the grade of your bluff catcher is going to be how vulnerable you are to villains' bluffs improving against you and how easily you can improve when behind. This hand does have 5 outs against aces with no spade, but the main thing that really helps it be quite a sturdy bluff catcher is the fact that villains' overcards will only ever be 1 against you here if they have an ace, so hands like Queen Jack don't have 2 overs. Contrast that to when you hold 10-7, which is a pure fold. That's going to be bad because villains' overcards are going to have more in the way of redraw against you. A grade B bluff catcher, this will be a hand that's mixing call and fold. Something like a mediocre 7 that's blocking some bluffs, is a bit vulnerable to villains' bluffing range improving, and isn't amazing at redraw on a 3 flush turn. This is going to be a hand that's just break even. It's easy to think this hand is a pure fold, just as it's easy to think that something like 9s is a fold. Of course, that's going to come down to the suit that you have. One pitfall that certain students succumbed to here when they did this question, when I used to run this course live and actually mark exams, was that they would say that 9s was a threshold hand or 9s was a grade B bluff catcher because it's mixing call and fold. 9s is not mixing call and fold. 9s with a spade is a pure call and 9s without a spade is a horrible call. Look at the EV. So don't just look at the combos. When there's 3 to a flush or sometimes even 2 to a flush, you have to look at suits with things like offsuit cards and pocket pairs. And of course suited cards too. A grade C bluff catcher, this will be a hand that does beat all bluffs but is nevertheless folding, something like 7-5. I think the 5 is just a miserable card to redraw into. 8-9 is going to dominate the hell out of you, and the card is probably going to block some bluffs as well. So 7-5 is a pure fold here. There are other examples too, such as the aforementioned 9s with no spade. Blocking lots of bluffs, bad redraw, and also quite vulnerable to bluffs. Let's move on to question 8. Question 8, as I recall, was probably one of the hardest questions in the grade 2 exam. When I ran this course live, I remember a lot of students scoring more poorly in this question than they had on the previous ones, and even on 9 and 10. I think part D is probably the hardest part of this, but part A, B, and C are also not totally simple. Why is 10-9 suited a lower EV call than the other 9x? This one isn't too bad, but we'll get to this. Why are we able to raise 8-7 but not 9-7? Very tricky blocker related phenomenon here. Why is Jack 10 suited not a good bluff raise? Again, blockers are going to be important. And then Queen 8 of diamonds is a better call than Queen 8 of clubs. Why? This one is super obscure and kind of an exercise in logic and problem solving. Let's get into the answers. Looking at the EV of various bluff catchers in our range here, let's start by looking at some 9x. So the question, part A, asks us why is 10-9 suited a lower EV call than other 9x? Looking at our reaction here, we can see that the 10-9 suited is typically going to be a mix, but all of the other 9x is just going to be calling. Villain's value range, however, doesn't start until about King 9, so Queen 9 and Jack 9 are both bluff catchers just like the 10-9 is, yet these ones are always calling and this one is folding. We'll turn on the EV view, we can see there are a few percentile differences between the Jack 9, Queen 9 and then the 10-9 relative. And I think what's going on here is just that the 10 is the card that tends to block more bluffs in villain's range. If we look at what villain is bluffing, quite a lot of their combos for pure bluffing are going to be things like King 10 and Queen 10, and the 10 is therefore a bit more of a common card in the bluffing range than the Jack is, because as you can see here, King Jack, Queen Jack, etc. are tending to just give up. Why are we able to raise the 8-7 but not the 9-7? So when we look at the raising range here, 9-7 is barely raising. It looks like the call EV is slightly higher, whereas the 8-7 is a bit more indifferent to raising. When we look at the diamond combo, in fact, the raising EV is actually slightly higher there, although this sim isn't solved to absolute accuracy, and so you're seeing a little bit of disagreement there. The solver not quite able to make up its mind, even though it thinks at this moment in time that one option is slightly higher EV than the other. You don't want to get too bogged down here, but the main idea with this is that villain is going to be bet folding some of the 9x combos from their range. If you look at their folding range here against a raise, a lot of it's going to be ace 9 or king 9, so you actually don't want to block that 9-8 as well as another hand that's just folding a lot of the time. They don't fold a lot of 8x when you raise them because they didn't bet their 8x in the first place, of course, favoring to check back turn with those combos, and they're grayed out, they're not reaching the river. As we can see, So when you're raising a river bet, you want to think about blocking villain's value and not blocking their bet folds, and 9x is just blocking bet folds, whereas 8x is only blocking value hands like pocket 8s or something of that nature. Part C, why is Jack 10 suited not a good bluff raise? Of course, this would be a horrible hand to raise with, and as you can see here, we're losing 35% of the pot after villain bets by raising. That's absolutely abominable. It's so bad. And the reason is that you need to be unblocking bluffs and blocking continues. This hand is just blocking the bet folds, but this time more so the bluff region bet folds than the value region like the 9x was blocking. Very bad idea to not interfere with the texture when you make this kind of raise. We have a theorem in grade 3, spoiler alert, called interference theorem, and it's all about making sure that you actually interfere with the same cards that villain is bet calling before you consider raising on the river. Unlike in spots where you check to, it's not correct to just bluff the bottom of your range. That's not always the case when you're check to either, but when you're facing a bet, you just have to fold usually with the bottom of your range and find your bluff raises further up in the absolute hand strength rankings. Finally, this obscure question, why is Queen 8 of diamonds a better call than Queen 8 of clubs? It's only marginally going to be the case that this is even true. You can see that EV is worse for calling the non-diamond combos, both spades and clubs, than it is for calling Queen 8 of diamonds. The idea here, though, is that villain is going to be giving up turn with a lot of their diamond combos because they're in turn going to block our backdoor floats from the flop and therefore block more of our folding range. If we go all the way back to the turn here and look at villain's bluff selection with a hand such as Queen 10, we can see that the diamond variant isn't betting as often as the spades or clubs. This means when villain reaches the river and bets on this node with a triple barrel, the diamonds that we have unblock more of the air and therefore just make a better hand with which to bluff catch. Don't worry if you didn't get part D, it's very tricky, but I do like to train my students eventually when they reach sort of grade 3 level to be able to think in this way, because sometimes these little differences do matter, but there are more important things to care about at grade 2 level, so don't worry too much about that one. Let's move on to question 9. Question 9 actually gives us an unknown flop and asks us to define a c-bet strategy, so we have 3 different textures here. This is a bit of an open-ended question where you can feel free to rant about whatever you want. I'd really like to hear you talk more about range advantage and nut advantage than most other factors when doing this exercise. Let's compare these 3 different flops now and take a look at the solver's strategic differences between all 3 of them. As we know, range advantage and nut advantage, you can replace nut advantage with relative polarization if you prefer, they're kind of the same thing for this purpose, are the main factors that dictate the elements of the strategy, which are going to be frequency and sizing respectively. On King 7/7 two-tone, the King is by far the best Broadway card for the small blind 3-betters range, and they're going to be doing really well on this texture. The other thing this texture does by having a pair on it is it makes it harder for the in-position player that's a pre-flop caller to actually redraw against overpairs by going runner-runner 2-pair. People miss this fine point, but if you have a hand like Jack 10 here on the button, you're actually drawing nearly dead against a hand like Aces, hoping only for backdoor straights to come in or runner-runner bolt. You can't 2-pair your way to victory against a pocket pair or King X on this texture. The 7 is also fairly bricky for the in-position player's range. They're not going to be hitting this card very frequently in a 3-bet pot, and so actually the nut advantage is quite preserved here, even though the flop is paired. If we were in a single raise pot, you would never see the solver choose to bet big here, but that's because the big blind's range would be much more polarized in a single raise pot than the button caller's range is in a 3-bet pot. Relative polarization is the be-all and end-all when it comes to bet size choices. So the solver's a bit torn here between betting small and betting big. It thinks the nut advantage is fairly significant but not gigantic, and therefore either sizing is going to work. One hand interestingly doesn't like betting big is pocket kings, and actually there is an EV loss by doing that here, although not a huge one. There is one of a couple of % pot, and the idea with that is that you're just going to block a lot of the normal calling range for a big bet, but unblock many hands that would call a small bet. If you bet small here, there's also a little pinch of raising going on, which is important to note, and therefore the pocket king's hand is going to be betting small and sometimes getting raised as well. We can summarize here by saying massive range advantage, 74% pot share for the out of position player here, and fairly big nut advantage, but the king is a little bit polarizing to the button's range, just creating a few more merged medium EV combos in small blind's range that are unique to that player. Things like tens, jacks, etc. are fairly good here and could big bet, but they're also just getting merged by this texture as our hands like ace queen, ace jack, ace 10. Meanwhile, the in-position player is going to just be a bit more polar here. If we turn on the EV display of their range, let's say we go ahead and bet, and then we look at their range in terms of EV, we can see that they have quite a lot of terrible hands and quite a lot of very good hands. The king is a polarizing card because it just creates more hands that are good, but also makes certain hands terrible. You'll note that when we bet small here, sixes is already indifferent, and that's much better than checking and leaving that hand with 24% pot share. It's important to understand that in situations where your range is doing incredibly well, denying equity becomes your main priority, and you do want to bet a lot of the time. That wouldn't be the case if your range was suffering and there was a bigger downside to betting for denial. Though of course many of the hands we bet for denial with are also going to benefit from elements of bluffing or value betting. Let's look at texture B. Texture B is a bit of an anomaly. You might look at this board at first sight and think this is a great board for range, and indeed your EV is actually quite good here, coming in at 56% of the pot. That said, I'd like to draw your attention to how merged the small blind's range is here, just how many mediocre hands they have, whereas the button's range is going to be a bit more polarized. When we turn on the in-position EV view, we can see there's a much higher density of terrible, atrocious hands, like low pairs that just aren't getting to 3-bet from the small blind as often, and ace-queen is the most prominent Broadway by far in the in-position player's range. A good way to understand why there's so little betting here is to basically admit that checking is a B0, and therefore when you choose to check, you choose a very small sizing. When your opponent's range has a higher density of great hands, i.e. ace-queen, and terrible hands, i.e. pocket sixes, than yours does, and that's as a concentration, not an absolute quantity, remember. Thinking back to lecture 9 here, that means that we want to go ahead and choose a tiny sizing very often, and the smallest sizing in our toolkit is of course B0. So we can go for a bit of B33 here, but this texture is actually fairly terrible, and I think another option that's not been included in the solver setup here that would have been interesting is using like 10% pot. I think in textures that you're doing okay, but where your opponent's range is really pulled out, you want to use a tiny sizing. Just like on a monotone flop, you'll see that too. Part C now. 333 is the ultimate nut advantage texture for the small blind's range. The EV of the overpairs is basically indisputable. They can't really get run or runnered by anything. They're totally invincible, and therefore we can go ahead and just bet them very big. As our value hands are the combos that want to drive our sizing, this nut advantage means that we want to use the biggest size in our toolkit here, which is B60. I wouldn't stress about this too much, and there won't be a giant EV loss from going small on this texture if you really want to, and that's because you can make up for lost ground later and urgency is low. But I would say that the most principled way to play here that will gel best with your understanding of theory will be to use a big bet or a check raise on this texture. As we've seen, if we check here and face a small bet, we continue quite dramatically often by raising, and this is typical of a spot where we just have a large nut advantage. Nut advantage decides sizing, range advantage decides our frequency, and while this is a spot where we're really polar and really crushing at the top of ranges, we're not doing as well on this texture as you might think, coming in at only 53% equity. That said, our EV on the flop is very high because our nut advantage is so redeeming, and because our value hands get such a great conversion of equity to EV. Take pocket aces, for example, a hand that comes in at 95% equity but is scooping up 277% of the pot in EV. It's basically the immortal nuts, is invincible. Question 10 concerns raising on the flop, and this is us facing a range bet, an action that we'll typically encounter from any thinking opponent on ace, ace-5, and some non-thinking opponents as well. A very common way for people to play, and quite rightly so, because button has such a range advantage here. Part A asks you to find a three-way mix. That's a hand that is 0 EV no matter what you do. It's basically calling, raising, or folding, but what are the pros and cons? What are the ingredients to this three-way mix? Why is pocket sevens raising sometimes? How do you explain that? And why is it getting up to the can raise line in the betting sink, to use the terminology and metaphor from lecture 6? Finally, ace 10 is a mix here too, but why are we raising this hand? Wouldn't we just be blowing them out of the pot? Surely we want to keep him in, no? How can you explain that it's okay to raise in this hand? If you can forgive my theatrics there, what I'm really trying to do is get inside the head of a more amateur poker player that's not as versed in thinking about the whole game tree, and I'm trying to give you deliberately some thought processes there that are a bit dicey so you can try to use your grade 2 knowledge to pick them apart. Let's do that now as we go through A, B, and C. Let's begin by locating a three-way mix in our range. That's a hand that can basically do either thing, and I've found one already at Queen 9 of spades. What's going on here is that this is obviously a frailness threshold hand. It's a hand that derives its EV mostly from improving or bluffing later, and that's usually going to be a worse thing than if we can just check down and win with showdown value. That's why you see a hand like King Jack never folding here, but Queen 9 of spades will be. King Jack will never fold even if it's hearts, but Queen 9 will fold sometimes with spades. So what's going on in this situation? Like, why are we so adverse to continuing with this backdoor? It's a bit flimsy. We're not realizing all of our equity all of the time. Of course, we're going to face a turn bet sometimes, so it does get reduced close to zero. Meanwhile, the hand has okay equity though, and it does have two reasonably good pair draws, as well as the more obvious and visually striking backdoor flush draw. This hand can raise as a bluff, meanwhile, for 0 EV, because it just about meets the criteria that it has to in order to bluff in this unfavorable world. When button bets here, we can have a look at out of positions EV. It's only 34% with range. Our hand is indifferent regardless of what it does. It can call, it can raise, it can fold. It's on the frailness threshold, and it's a relatively good bluff raise. If we had a hand that was a terrible bluff raise, like the Jack 7 of hearts, for example, with the dead suit blockers there, there's no way we'd ever get to raise that in such an unfavorable world. Again, you've got to be more selective with your bluffs in such a situation. So Queen 9 is a good example of a hand that just everything falls on zero. Fold, call, raise, doesn't matter what you do. But if you raise all the time, you become a maniac. If you fold all the time, you become a nit. And if you call all the time, you become a station. You really can't win. So maybe this is where the RNG is your friend. Pocket 7s is a two-way mix that's doing some raising. The best way to understand this is that the hand just has quite a lot of EV. It's coming in equity-wise at 55%, and while it's going to be super thin as a raise here and will probably be a small dog when called, remember its redraw equity to a boat gives it insane implied odds when a 7 comes, and of course the fold equity is incredibly useful. The way to think about this raise is somewhere between a hybrid raise and a thin value raise, and in grade 3 we're going to get stuck into the 5 categories of flop raise very soon. Finally, for grade 2 and for this exam, ace 10 is also a mix here. This is probably kind of obvious to you, and I'm sure you're not that surprised, but the imaginary student who's asking these oracle questions is surprised, so don't we want to blow him out of the pot? The student might ask. Well, the idea is that that's okay. Like when we make villain fold, they typically have a very bad hand anyway, and we can do that. We can limit what we win against bluffs in order to win more against made hands in their range. That's totally fine. These terrible hands that are folding here in button strategy is not a problem because we just make more against the hands that are calling, like the weaker ace X, king high that has to call. You just have to defend so obscenely wide here after you've range bet, and as an exploitative tip bet for you guys, over raise the spot. Like, don't actually mix when you have the Queen 9 here, just because in theory it's meant to be a three-way mix with Queen 9 of spades. You should just always raise against most mortals and humans against whom you'll actually play poker in real life. Do we want to keep him in the pot? Not necessarily. Yes, ideally, but you know, it's a bit of a trade-off. And how can you explain that it's okay to raise this hand? It's basically just value. You're sacrificing frequency of being in the hand for magnitude of how big the pot gets. So you're basically saying, okay, I'll win money from your range less often, but I'll win more money the times I do win money. That's what it's all about. I hope you found this exercise useful and you got a lot out of the grade 2 exam. The thing to do now is basically go over this again if you need to, revise any classes again if you need to, and then once you're ready, let's take the plunge and get started on grade 3. Grade 3 is going to cover a wide array of topics from triple barrel bluff selection to building flop and turn, raising ranges, and basically look a bit more at some of the finer details and points of game theory. Grade 3 is a really fun grade for me to create, and I look forward to teaching it to you guys really soon. So I'll see you there for grade 3 of the Carrot Poker School. This has been Pete Clark. See you guys soon. Bye for now.